Hi, my name is Josh Cooper, and I research the impact of the shock absorption properties of basketball shoe cushioning systems on the likelihood of lower extremity overuse injuries. So as a high school varsity basketball player who has suffered lower body overuse injuries and has worn various types of basketball shoes, I am extremely interested in the ability of basketball shoes to protect from or maybe even cause injuries. So in my study, the type of injury that I researched was lower body overuse injuries. And overuse injuries are caused by repetitive force or trauma. And I looked specifically at the lower body because that is the part of the body where that is most directly impacted by the type of shoe that a basketball player wears. So after reading countless research articles on various different types of various different characteristics of basketball shoes, including studies about the effects of shoe height, high top versus low top, the hardness of the midsole, and even comparing injuries in basketball shoes versus military shoes, I noticed that few known studies specifically researched the effect of shock absorption properties of the midsole material in basketball shoes. And shock absorption is defined as a reduction of the potentially harmful impact forces during activity. And the purpose of my study was to determine the relationship between shock absorption properties of basketball shoe cushions and the reaction force back up onto the foot. And my hypothesis was that there is an inverse relationship between shock absorption capabilities of basketball shoe cushioning systems, as I measured in Phase 1, and the reaction force on the foot during athletic movements, as I measured in Phase 2. So in my studies, both Phase 1 and Phase 2, I tested 4 different cushioning systems. The first was the N1 Tai Chi. The second was the LeBron 16. The third is the N1 Attack. And the fourth is the Nike Zoom Shift. And I picked these 4 cushioning systems because they have different characteristics which I hoped would lead to variances in the measurements of shock absorption and force on the foot in my Phase 1 and Phase 2. So in Phase 1, I measured the relative shock absorption levels of each of the 4 deconstructed cushioning systems through a drop test. So in the drop test, I taped the 4 deconstructed cushions onto a force platform. I then dropped a metal weight, 176.2 grams. I dropped that metal weight through a PVC pipe onto a specific location on the heel of each of the cushions. And then the force platform measured the total force transmitted through the cushion onto the force platform. So the cushion with the best shock absorption would reduce the force that goes through the cushion onto the platform, and then the shoe that had the most force on the platform would have the worst shock absorption. And then an ANOVA test and a Tukey test were performed to test for significance. In Phase 2 of the study, I measured the reaction force on the foot to see the relationship between shock absorption and force on the foot. And this study had 5 participants, each performed jump landings wearing each of the 4 shoes. So this time I tested the cushions as the whole shoe, not just the deconstructed version. And in this phase, the participants jumped off a 0.43 meter high bench onto the ground wearing advanced load sole insoles. And the load sole insoles measured the force up onto the foot instead of onto the ground, and measured the reaction force back up. And I also performed an ANOVA test and Tukey test to test for significance in this phase as well. And for the results of my study, looking at the bar graph for Phase 1, you can see that the Nike Zoom Shift, which is all the way to the right, had pretty significantly more force onto the platform, and this was with statistical significance. So this told me that the Zoom Shift had inferior shock absorption capabilities compared to the other 3 cushions. And then in Phase 2, you can see that the Zoom Shift, also all the way to the right, did have the most force onto the foot. And then the LeBron with the star over it, that shoe had the least force on the foot, which does make sense because that shoe was actually priced as the most expensive. So now my hypothesis was supported because the greater shock absorption, the shoe with the worst shock absorption measured in Phase 1, which is the Zoom Shift, did have the most force on the foot in Phase 2. And important connection is that force on the foot is correlated to the likelihood of overuse lower extremity injuries, because overuse injuries are caused by repetitive force. So if there's more force on the foot, then there is therefore a greater likelihood of overuse injuries. And one application for my study is that the results can be useful to basketball footwear companies such as Nike, Adidas, and more, and it'll allow them to better understand the impact of shock absorption on overuse injuries. And then moving on to a conclusion, one conclusion I made was that the use of different materials in basketball shoe cushioning systems does lead to variances in the shock absorption and force measurements. So I used different cushioning systems and I got different measurements. So it may seem simple, but it shows that it does matter the type of material used or the type of cushion used. And I also concluded that increased shock absorption capabilities of basketball shoe footwear decreases the amount of force on the foot during athletic movements, therefore also decreasing the likelihood of lower extremity injuries. So that is the major conclusion from this study. And for future research, something I would really consider doing is really doing a study of the materials of the shoes and looking at what in the materials of each cushion caused it to perform the way it did. Thank you very much.